Okay, welcome everybody to our Cohort 2 Professional Development. Today we have two guest speakers. We have Ariana Whiting, who is our Part C Director, and Julie Giacone, who is a distinguished educator with the Department of Education. And they have prepared a presentation for all of you and us on the Part C to Part B transition, or the transition from early intervention to early childhood special education. So in a second, I will turn it over to them. After they present it, there will be Q&A, but you can also post Q&A questions in the chat and we will attempt to answer them along the way as well. And then we will have some time after the presentation to answer any general questions that you might have. So with all of that being said, I will turn it over to Ariana.
Thank you, Sandy. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Happy first snow here in Maine for most of us, but probably not for Aroostook County, I would assume. We are going to talk a little bit, as Sandy said, about the transition from early intervention potentially into early childhood special education. We use lots of acronyms and jargon, so please raise your hand, interrupt if you have any questions, or we start to speak in alphabet soup. Part C, we like to say, is cribs, to Part B, to beds. So that kind of is helpful if we're referring to Part C, early intervention, as Part C, and Part B, Section 619 of IDEA, early childhood special education. So forgive us if we start to go down that path. So my name is Ariana Whiting. I am the Part C Early Intervention Coordinator for Early Intervention for Me, which is our early intervention program overseen by Child Development Services, which of course is overseen by the Maine Department of Education. And I'm joined by Julie Giacone, who Sandy introduced as a distinguished educator. Julie, would you like to introduce yourself?
Oh, thanks, Ariana. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Julie Giacone. I'm an early childhood special education consultant, working on the team from the Office of Special Services and Inclusive Education. Pleasure to be here today. And I'll start us off going over some of the presentation objectives. So we're going to provide you today with an overview of the transition from Part C, which is early intervention, when a child and family has an individualized family service plan, to Part B 619, which is early childhood special education, where the child would have an individual education program. We're going to discuss best practices for a nice, smooth transition between early intervention and special education services provided by the local school district. So the topics today, again, we're going to provide you with an overview of that transition from Part C to Part B. We're going to discuss child find and the referral and the data and information that comes from Part C and is provided to Part B. And then we're going to go over the timeline of transition, data reporting, and we have some additional slides at the end that we have put in for just additional and further details should you have any questions.
Thank you, Julie. So the kind of background on why this is important: IDEA requires that early intervention facilitates a smooth transition into early childhood special education for all potentially eligible children. And states can define what a potentially eligible child is in their state. And in Maine, we have defined that as any child that is receiving early intervention. So an IFSP team would not, an individualized family service plan team, it's the IEP team for babies, essentially, would not determine in advance that a child wouldn't be eligible for early childhood special education. We would essentially treat all children as if they might be eligible. But it's important to note that all children are not eligible. Eligibility must be determined for Part B special education, and we'll talk about the path to get there in subsequent slides. So this is one of those slides that can kind of ground us in this, but it also will be something that you might want to refer back to, and will really give you a good overview of the differences between early intervention and early childhood special education, or really special education in general. So some of the main differences, of course, are the age range. In early intervention, we serve children from birth until their 3rd birthday, and the environment that services take place within. So early intervention must occur within the child's natural environment, which is really viewed as primarily their home, but can also be their childcare or community, or anywhere really that they have the opportunity to learn from, learn within the context of their daily life. As Julie mentioned, it's guided by an individualized family service plan. So the focus is really on the whole family and how the child interacts with their family and their engagement, independence, and social relationships within their family system. We recognize that anything that impacts a member of a family impacts the entire family system. So our goal is to really support the parents, the siblings, and really increase the engagement of the entire family system. Eligibility is a little bit different for early intervention, but also the same. So I'll start with the same. The definition of developmental delay in Maine is the same for early intervention and early childhood special education, the criteria based on a developmental evaluation. We do have 2 additional eligibility categories in early intervention. One is called established condition of risk. And so those are infants or toddlers that are diagnosed with a medical or developmental or hereditary genetic condition that could result in a developmental delay. So we aren't quite serving children that are at risk of a developmental delay, but we do have a specified list of conditions that automatically qualify little ones for early intervention. The third is related to developmental delay. We essentially have this kind of evaluation override category, where if the results of the evaluation, if the clinicians that are completing the evaluation feel that the results of the evaluation are not necessarily showing the child's impact to their early education, their engagement in their home environment, they can use what's called informed clinical opinion. And there are very specific parameters around that. But for little babies, there may be some, things that are being seen that the evaluation doesn't catch, or there could be a discrepancy in the expressive and receptive communication, for example, is a very common ICO, we call it. But it essentially allows the evaluators to override the results of the evaluation and make a child eligible. The other difference is that we meet and review the IFSP every 6 months. The services do run for 1 year, like an IEP, but we meet and check in every 6 months on the progress towards what we call outcomes rather than goals. So recently, as I was I just returned to work from maternity leave, so I had a lot of time to think about work a little bit outside of it. And I was thinking about this transition process, and I've always thought of it as early intervention's responsibility to transition children into early childhood special education, because of course that's my priority as the leader of the early intervention program. But then I started to think about child find and how this is a really new way to look at child find, I think, for districts where typically, and I'm not a school person, so forgive me, but typically I think when schools are doing child find, the child is already enrolled in school, right? So you don't really have to go find the children like we do in early intervention in their homes and communities. So this led me to think about this process as early intervention is really the dream referral source for child find. We know the kids really well, and it's our job to really make sure that the transition goes smoothly into early childhood special education. So we'll support the family through that. We'll give a lot of rich information. We may have completed an evaluation within the past year that could be used to inform eligibility. But I think that it really could be seen as another referral to early childhood special education, but there are some very specific protections in place for those children, some kind of priorities, I guess, that they get just by nature of being a child that was served by the early intervention system. So two of those are the support that they'll receive through the process from their early intervention team. And this, we'll talk a little bit about some data reporting requirements, but a very important one is making sure that the IEP is written and ready to implement by the child's 3rd birthday, if they're eligible, of course, for special education. So this slide is kind of the watered down timeline of the transition activities. We can provide in the future, I think, more nitty gritty things that happen in between different meetings, and we'll talk about those today. But if you were to leave today's presentation with 3 main timelines to think about, I chose these 3 based on some conversations that we've had over the past couple of years with this transition. One is that schools want to know about these kiddos as soon as possible, which makes a lot of sense because they're planning for their supports and services. By law, early intervention can pass along information to early childhood special education at 2 years and 3 months or 9 months before the child's 3rd birthday. And that's really the earliest we can release that information. Then early intervention has to hold a transition conference by the time the child reaches 2 years and 9 months or 3 months before their 3rd birthday. And this is the compliance indicator for early intervention, that we have to meet that indicator unless the child is referred to early intervention later than that time. And that's an example of the additional slides that we have at the end of the slideshow. If people have questions about that, you can refer to those or reach out and I would be happy to talk about that. Then the Part B, early childhood special education compliance indicator, is that the IEP must be written and implemented or ready to implement by the child's 3rd birthday. So to get there, we have 3 meetings. The first we call the transition conference, and we'll talk about what each of these meetings entails. This is a Part C responsibility meeting. Then we have an IEP referral meeting and an IEP eligibility meeting, and both of those are the responsibility of Part B, early childhood special education 619. So the transition conference is hosted by Early Intervention for Me. The service coordinator schedules that meeting and invites the SAU representative to attend. The goal really is to introduce the family to the SAU representative, IEP team. And since they are hosting that meeting, they need to send an advanced written notice for that meeting. So this happens, as I mentioned, between the age of, the earliest it can happen is 2 years and 3 months. The latest it can happen is 2 years and 9 months. And really the goal is just to introduce the family to the IEP team. The Part B responsibilities in this process is to come to the meeting and then talk a little bit about what Part B looks like in their district. What evaluations might take, sorry, we're not going to talk about evaluations. What services might look like if the child was eligible for early childhood special education in their district, and to provide the procedural safeguards to the family. Now, Julie, would you like to talk a little bit about the IEP referral meeting?
Sure. So again, I just want to when we say Part C, that is early intervention, and Part B 619 is special education. So I like the way the slides have kind of delineated the responsibilities of each team. So for the referral meeting, it is the responsibility of Part C to attend the IEP meeting and to share information with the IEP team from Early Childhood Special Education with any and all relevant information from the individual family service plan. So anything about Part C, present levels, any relevant formative assessment data, and so forth. So it's the responsibility of the school district under Part B 619 to actually schedule the meeting and ensure that it is a mutually agreed upon time for all members, including the family. Provide the parent with 7-day advance written notice of the meeting. Invite the early intervention for Maine representative, and to review the child's present levels of performance from that IFSP. I really want to emphasize that the information that Part C comes to the table with is really critical for the Part B team in their determination of eligibility.
Thank you, Julie. So this is something that has been kind of an iterative process when CDS had the FAPE obligation for early childhood special education kiddos. Over the years, I've been here for about 10 years, and we've done it 2 different ways. We would have the transition conference on one day, and then we would have the IEP referral meeting in the future. And when we shifted to that, it felt a little bit disjointed. So what we will often do is hold the transition conference, and then immediately after that meeting, hold the IEP referral meeting. So it's important to note that those are 2 separate meetings, and they're kind of seen as sequentially held. And I think I see here that I have consecutively, but it's important to note that they're not consecutive. Sorry. They are 2 separate meetings hosted by 2 separate systems. So Early Intervention for Maine hosts the transition conference, and then that could be at 11:45 today. And then at noon, Part B, Early Childhood Special Education, could host their IEP referral meeting immediately afterwards. So it helps with scheduling, and it's family friendly, but both parties would need to send their advance written notice because they are 2 separate meetings held by 2 separate systems. So that's kind of a tip. And I recognize that folks have already been doing this for a couple of months. So you may already be doing that, you may not. But it does help to ensure that those timelines that we just talked about are met.
So 619 Part B, Early Childhood Special Education Eligibility Determination. During this process, the IEP team must consider all the relevant information on that individual family service plan. It's important to also note that while considering it and incorporating it into the evaluation, we don't duplicate the data from the IFSP onto the IEP. Each child, there must be an eligibility observation that takes place that considers the current teacher, the learning environment, supportive services, and just like with our older children, where there's a 3-prong eligibility, there has to be evidence of a disability, there has to be an adverse impact, and it requires specially designed instruction in order to remediate or to access the curriculum. So adverse effect, I apologize, Connecticut calls it adverse impact. Adverse effect is discovering the impact of the disability on the child's educational performance. And it is a crucial part of determining eligibility, and it plays a real vital role in designing specially designed instruction.
Thank you, Julie. I'm going to pause and look at Deb Mullis's chat here. And so Deb is asking, if those 2 meetings are held consecutively, would they be held at 2 years, 3 months, or would teams wait until 2 years and 9 months? That is a great question, Deb. I would say that holding them consecutively doesn't necessarily impact when you would hold them, because the requirement really is that and we'll talk a little bit about data reporting details, which might help with this conversation. But the requirement is that it happens between 2 years and 3 months and 2 years and 9 months. But then it starts the clock after the IEP referral meeting to obtain parental consent for evaluations and then complete those evaluations within 60 days. So you want to make sure you have time to do that process and then write the IEP by the time the child turns 3. So I will say that, and maybe I'll stop there, but I'm just thinking of in practice, if we have a really complex child in early intervention that might be like medically complex, or we know that, or we anticipate that maybe multiple evaluations would need to be done to determine eligibility, we might hold that transition conference a little bit earlier to give more time to get the evaluations done to write the IEP by 3. But it has to be done within 60 days and the IEP has to be written by 3. So that's really the logic behind the 2 years and 9 month deadline. I see another. Is this okay with everyone if we just stop and answer questions? If an eligibility observation was completed recently for Part C eligibility, could the team use that for eligibility for Part B? I love this question. Can I answer this too? I'm looking to Sandy. Stop me if you'd like.
Go ahead. We'll let you know if it's not right.
Perfect. I love that. Yes, absolutely. So if the evaluation has been completed within a year, right? That's the time frame that you can use the evaluation.
Yeah, and it meets the criteria of
Yep.
the evaluation, or sorry, observation.
Yep. So we use the Patel Developmental Inventory to determine eligibility for Part C, early intervention. And I know that that can be used to determine eligibility or to kind of inform eligibility for Part B. Of course, it's only one component of the eligibility process, but that or a psychological evaluation, I would imagine, could be used to factor into the eligibility determination. But we don't do like speech evaluations or specific discipline evaluations in early intervention because all children are eligible under the criteria of developmental delay. And we use the BDI primarily to determine that.
Well, and I think Kate's question is specific to observation.
Yep.
So do you do an observation in Part C to look at eligibility, or do you do an observation that is part of what you might present? I think they're looking to use that.
Okay, yes. I would say no, because especially because the environment is different in early intervention. So we're focused primarily on the home environment. And I understand that Part B eligibility is more focused on the educational environment. So it just might not match up, and it might be an insufficient observation to inform the adverse effect or impact, I think, in the educational environment. So I guess what I would say is the BDI results could probably be used in that conversation, but the observation piece would likely need to occur on top of the BDI in addition to.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it's a key difference between early intervention eligibility and early childhood special education eligibility.
Absolutely. How would we access the IFSP? Will the EI case manager forward them? Yes. So the EI service coordinator, which is the case manager, is responsible for scheduling the transition conference. So in order to schedule the transition conference, the service coordinator seeks the parents' consent to share their child's information. And after they get parental consent, they will send, we call it a transition packet. And it would be likely the eligibility evaluation and the IFSP, and any evaluations that we referred for, like a psychological evaluation that may have occurred or an audiological evaluation. You do have access to children in sync, but because Part C and Part B are two separate systems, there's kind of a wall between them in sync. When a child is essentially referred to early childhood special education from early intervention, a new record is opened in the special education data system, but it does not carry over the data from early intervention. So sync would not have the IFSP or the Part C evaluations in that child's record. All right. Any other questions before we go along for now?
I think you probably just answered it, but you don't, school districts don't automatically have access to Part C, right? Lisa
Right
was
now,
asking if they
yeah.
have access.
They have access to the children in their district that are in the Part B data system, which I'm not the data manager anymore, so I'm not super sure how that's happening. But as we've kind of contemplated all of this and knowing the data system as I do, the wheels are turning about when and if and how that might be appropriate in the future, if that is helpful at all. I guess the short answer is no, not at this time. Julie, do you want to talk about how we get to the eligibility determination?
Certainly. So again, we have the different sections here, early intervention for me and their responsibilities versus the Part B 619 school district special education, early childhood special education responsibilities. So even though the school district has begun the evaluation, has begun testing, Part C continues to provide services. So I think it's important to know that they continue to provide services until the child's third birthday, and there will be ongoing communication of any relevant information with the school district's IEP team. The Part B 619 IEP team, their responsibilities are to seek, obviously before testing, the parental consent for the evaluation. Evaluations are completed, reconvening the team, and I think it's important too that obviously it depends upon what the child's needs are, but the idea would be that these are not completed in silos, and that if you have like an SLP and an OT, or an SLP and a special ed teacher, SLP and a school psych, that you are collaborating during this process. So the IEP eligibility meeting, ensure again, this has been mentioned several times, that a mutually agreed upon time and place for the meeting is determined. Provide the parent and guardian with 7 days advance written notice. Invite the early intervention for me representatives with the parent's verbal approval. And remember that the Part C has continued to provide services up until the child's third birthday. Review the evaluation results, areas of concern. And I think it's important too that we include areas of strength that we may see while we're reporting the findings out to families. So if the child is eligible, the child's IEP is drafted and seeking parental consent to provide those special education services. So placement, determining placement. So the child must receive special education services in the least restrictive environment. And the decision around this starts with the least restrictive educational environment, where the child has the opportunity to learn from typically developing peers and practice skills in the context which they're needed. Now, it's important to note that there's a continuum of service delivery. There's a continuum of placements, but the goal is ultimately to provide the most appropriate and effective educational environment for the child, so the child has access to typical peers and the curriculum. And this is me as well. So the eligibility meeting. So upon review of the evaluation results, the responsibilities of the school district include, if the child is found eligible, for preschool special education services. The IEP team completes the IEP by developing the goals and determining the frequency and intensity of services, as well as the placement for those services. If the child is not found eligible for preschool special education services, just like in the older grades, the parent is provided with prior written notice explaining the findings and along with procedural safeguards.
Thank you, Julie. I would like to pause before we dive into this data discussion and answer a couple questions in the chat. Sandy, would you like me to answer this, or would you like to answer Kate's question? Is a release of information required for sharing info between Part C and the SAU?
Well, I would like you to answer it and just kind of share how we've been explaining it in light of some upcoming changes.
Perfect, thank you. So I'll make this short and sweet. I will try. We had state monitoring from the Office of Special Education Programs last fall. And during that time, we learned that we were not fully understanding what's called notification to early childhood special education of all children engaged in early intervention. So we are writing a joint policy to address that, which really changes the way that we do this. Previously, we always sought parental consent to share information at the transition. We learned that we should be sharing information about all children without parental consent, and then we seek parental consent to share the IFSP and the evaluations and the further information. But there is a specific list of demographic information that should be shared with Part B special education about all children that are engaged in early intervention, unless their parents choose to withhold that information because they don't want to move forward with the transition process. So we are putting that out for public comment very, very soon. And we'll make sure that everyone knows when that time comes, and they'll have an opportunity to read the policy and provide written comment if you'd like. All of what I've shared today is in that policy, and it really just clarifies the timelines in alignment with IDEA and federal timelines, and then some specific choices that we've made as a state, such as treating all children in early intervention as potentially eligible for early childhood special education. And we're choosing to send that automatic notification when the children reach the age of 2 years and 6 months. So that then between 2 years and 6 months and 2 years and 9 months, we can start really working together to schedule the transition conference and formally kick off the transition process. So a kind of tough question right now. Right now, we are seeking parental consent before sharing information. Very soon, after we go through the public comment process and this policy is formalized, we will begin notifying without parental consent, unless the parent does not want their information to go on and they don't want to move forward with the transition process. If a 3-year-old child does not attend a program, i.e. they continue to remain in the home, how do we determine adverse effect in relation to accessing their education?
Yes, so I'm gonna throw in the chat. I think I've found it, the user reference to observations. So it can be done across it can be done across different settings, including observations within the educational environment, if the child is participating in an educational environment. So it could also be done in another setting, basically looking to see, once again, it's part of that adverse effect determination. You're wanting to see if that child's disability is impacting their abilities, and potentially looking at educational settings as well.
All right, are we ready to talk about data? I alluded to the fact that I was the data manager before this position, so I really love data. And the joint transition policy that I just mentioned is really based on all of these indicators that we submit to the federal government in what is called the State Performance Plan Annual Performance Review. And we analyze the extent to which we're adhering to these requirements. So the indicators listed here, the first one that has a C in front of it is the Part C early intervention requirement, that we hold the transition conference before the child reaches the age of 2 years and 9 months. And I say in general there because, as I mentioned earlier, there are some nuances for kiddos that are referred to early intervention late, or if their parents are not able to hold the transition conference before that time. Then the requirements that we felt were really relevant for special education were the least restrictive environment, the child outcome summary related to preschool, and we won't get into that too much today, but I think it's very relevant to this conversation, and I do have a slide in the references very briefly touching on that. And then these are the big ones. The percentage of children that are evaluated within 60 days of parental consent, and the percentage of children that are referred by Part C before they turn 3, who are found Part B eligible and have an IEP implemented by their 3rd birthday. So these two kind of act in tandem to meet this requirement. Really, the overarching goal of all of these is that a child has an IEP written and ready to implement on their 3rd birthday. So I've kind of talked a little bit about late referrals to Part C. There are 3 kind of distinct categories that guide early interventions actions based on the timing of the referral. There are some slides at the end of the slideshow that outline those timeframes and what actions will take place. I didn't want to get into it today because I really want people to leave with the requirements in a kind of typical scenario. But of course, I think questions arise when we get outside of that typical scenario, such as, why did I get a referral for a child that's not yet 3, that never received early intervention? That would be a child that was referred less than 45 days before their 3rd birthday. So if we want to we do have time, I think, to talk about that if we want to, but we wanted to make sure that we left plenty of time for questions.
And IEP by 3, really very important to remember. It is mandatory according to IDEA. So by the time the child reaches 3 years of age, if eligible, that child must have that individual education program drafted and completed. It's important to note, as the next paragraph states, that if school is not in session, for example, during the summer, right, and the IEP is written during the summer to make sure and ensure that it is written by the child's 3rd birthday, the IEP does not need to be implemented until school begins. So again, it's important, IEP by 3, and this information is reported to the feds. The states have to report back. So districts report to the state reports to the feds.
I think that's a really nice segue, Julie, into this question that's in the chat. Sandy, would you like me to read it out loud just in case people aren't reading the chat?
No, but I just want to say I realized I put in the wrong reference for observation, and I'm trying to find it at the same time as listening. So I will see if I can do that at a different time. But yeah, I can read it. And
okay.
So Lucy, you want to know about the 60-day time frame for evaluations, and I know that this has been a shift, but right now, currently in user, it is listed as 60 calendar days for the evaluation timeline. So if this shortens the time, you will want to take that into consideration when you're mapping out those 60 days of when that evaluation needs to be completed. And then there is a question that you asked about transportation outside the catchment area. And so this is one of those probably individualized, let's look at the specific situation. But generally, if there is no expectation for you to transport outside your catchment area, unless you are transporting to a special purpose school or placement that was determined by the IEP, or if you are unable to provide FAPE or programming within your catchment area and you need to transport outside your area because you do not have anything available in your catchment area. And so the longevity question on that is really based on how you're answering those questions that I just, or looking at it through that lens. And I'm happy to talk to you individually as well if they are specific cases about transportation.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so Deb wants to know about late referrals, and we do have some slides for that. So there are 3 distinct categories of late referrals. One is children that are referred to Part C less than 135 days before their 3rd birthday. And that number might seem very random, but I think of it as 45 plus 90. So we have 45 days to complete an eligibility evaluation and determine eligibility for Part C. That's one of our performance indicators. And then we have to hold the transition conference more than 90 days before the 3rd birthday. So there are some situations where it just so lines up that we don't have time to determine eligibility for Part C and write the IFSP before that 90 days approaches. And so we are not required to hold the transition conference more than 90 days before the 3rd birthday. We will still make every effort to hold a transition conference as soon as we possibly can, because that child is considered eligible for and served by Part C. So I'm getting to Deb's question. Then children that are referred less than 90 days, we again are not required to hold a transition conference in any of those cases, but we often will, because really we want to facilitate that smooth transition. The child is served by early intervention, and we want to make sure that the transition process moves forward. The 3rd category answers Deb's question directly, and these are the children that, because they're referred less than 45 days before their 3rd birthday, we don't have a chance to determine them eligible and serve them in early intervention. And so we're essentially allowed, with parental consent, to reroute that referral directly to Part B special education so that they can begin the process of determining eligibility for Part B. And Sandy has put the user citation in the chat. And I will stop sharing because that is really the majority of our slides. And I think we could probably pull up a slide to answer questions if we need to.
Thank you, Ariana and Julie. Does anybody have any further questions about the Part C to Part B transition or any other early childhood special education transition questions? And that Deb Mullis, she has a lot of questions today, didn't she? You would think, Deb, you're like a legend. You should know all this.
I just asked because I figured other people might have those same
Okay.
questions too.
I love it. You're
Thank
our,
you.
you're our, whatever in the audience, right?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
We recently evaluated a student for going from Part C to B, and looking at the category of developmental delay, the child did not qualify under developmental delay. We are getting close to that third birthday. And the team determined at that time to evaluate for speech and language, because based on that evaluation, we saw some articulation concerns. So my question is, are we going to be considered late for implementing that IEP?
I don't
If
think so.
If they qualify under speech and language?
No, because you're doing your due diligence, right? And the child, the IEP team determined that they did not qualify under developmental delay. And so the IEP team posed another disability question, and you had did you have the parent sign a different consent? That would
Yes.
start the timeline. So
Mhm.
then
Yep.
you're all set.
Okay,
Yes. Yeah.
thank you.
Mhm. Oh, so Pat, it looks like Pat asked a question about how you would do an observation in the learning center when they're not in a school. So this is where I would love to ask some of our CDS folks or our cohort 1, if you're on here, how are you facilitating that? I know that some children are already in a childcare setting. And then I've also heard that some have invited them in to be in an educational setting to complete some of the evals and be exposed to other children while they can do that. So I'd love to hear from others that have lived this to hear how you're doing that.
I can, I guess, try to answer, and as we've kind of been figuring it out. But we've done it several ways. If the kids are in a child care setting, we go observe there, obviously. We've had kids come we have universal pre-K in our district, so we've had kids come in and we'll pair like the evaluation. They'll come in for like, say, their speech eval into one of our buildings, and then we'll take them out like on the playground with our pre-K class and do the observation out there. We've done it in like at like story time at the library was another one. I think it's just, you kind of just have to be creative about it.
Thank you, Kate. Those were helpful. Anybody from CDS want to jump in and share?
We often have children come into our preschool program for the observation. So we have 4 classrooms, so it works out well for many of the children and parents.
Okay, so we have some suggestions as well. Deb had put in that they've used information from the observation in educational setting. And then Lisa shared that they create a situation during testing, kind of similar when other children from pre-K could come into the environment with the student and the observation was done. So thank you for those ideas and suggestions. Any other questions today? Okay, I want to remind everybody that we are meeting again next week. We wanted to fit 2 meetings in this month. And
Sandy,
because, yes.
sorry, Sue Terrell up here, cohort 1.
Hey, Sue.
Hi, I have a question and just seeking some clarification. What's the progress, I guess, on our like EUT kids within our catchment area? My small local Bower Bank school district of 12 kids, like pulling those districts into somehow with their superintendents into some of these cohorts and where those discussions might be at. just as we move more and more forward, like a lot of us are already in a cohort that are the receiving school for all of those kids. And if they were to enroll in pre-K, they would come to us as a pre-K.
Let me just clarify. Are you
Sure.
talking about EUT students or students without schools?
I am talking about kids that belong to a school district that might be a school district of 12, like Bower Bank is its own school district with its own superintendent. We're 100% receiver of all of their kids, pre-K through 12. Medford, Lakeview Plantation. Like I could give you a long list of small school districts in our area, in between myself, now with Milo School District being a Cohort 2 adopter, Guilford being a Cohort 1 adopter. Some of us are the receivers for 100% of the kids in those districts. There is no operating building in these schools. So pulling, it's David Walker happens to be the superintendent of several, like pulling, maybe having a discussion about how they become part of a cohort, or what we would do under Child Find with those kiddos, because currently they would have to go through the CDS process, even though I would be taking them ultimately. So I raised this issue last year and nobody, it was all new. And I think sometimes people don't understand the rural nature of some of what we deal with, and then my other question is the same with the EUT. Some of us are 100% receiver of those EUT kiddos that live in these small communities. So how are we going to serve those kids as we transition? And that they're not left in the wind until the end of Cohort 4. And then they start becoming our kiddos. You know what I mean? So I just would love to know how the DOE is planning, I guess, to help us capture those kids earlier and to intervene earlier and save those same families, that same transition that we're saving all of our other 3- and 4-year-old families. Does that make sense?
Yes.
I just
I
wanted
think-
to bring it back to you guys, like forefront of your mind as we continue to move forward.
Yeah, and I can give you an update. How about that?
Perfect.
And actually, I'm going to ask Lou to come on and share a little bit of what he's been doing to, as we know, now that we're in Cohort 2, we really only have 2 more years for school districts to transition. And so Lou has spent quite a bit of time recently doing some work for us. And Lou, do you mind sharing kind of the work that you've been doing?
Well, I've been working obviously with all of the districts that didn't respond or had responded with great uncertainty. And I think we rounded up about 30 to 50 of them in the last couple of months. The EUTs is a project that I am working on, and I hope to have resolution to all the EUTs by December. So hopefully, I understand your point. If you're getting all unorganized territory kids in, it would seem obvious that you should be in charge, but technically you're not. And the name you gave me, David, was it Walter?
David Walker.
Yeah, he's a tough guy to get a hold of, but I will report back no later than December on.
Okay,
where
email is the best way to get David.
Sure. I'll give it another try.
If you need that email, Lou, to circle me in. It's definitely a conversation I've had with David. And again, it's 3. I know he's superintendent of 3 small school districts. It may be more than that. I only receive kids from him from 3, and I guess I just want to make sure that they do come to us. Earlier is better. If any are in the CDS pathway right now, I send them, like we want to start earlier. We're seeing the success. So and if he doesn't want to, I'd want to be part of those conversations with David, but because we talked about Child Find and responsibilities and what has needed to be, because he was under review last year. So, he's definitely aware.
I'll make it a priority to try to get a hold of him this week because this is the last group that we have to contact. And I think Matinicus is still one, but they have no kids, but they still have to decide what to do.
Right. And if they did have kids, those kids would go somewhere, and knowing where that somewhere is, and I'm happy to have a conversation if you set something up with David.
Yep, will do.
Amy Christensen would be the other one that more receives some of his students. So she's a cohort 2, SAD 41.
So they've all districts have been connected with. We had a small group of districts that wouldn't respond to Lou's attempts to reach out. They've been sent a letter. And we're slowly starting to hear.
Okay.
Some of it is changes in administration. We weren't necessarily, our emails were probably going nowhere, or phone calls. So we should have a fairly good understanding of who is in cohort 3, I would say soon. And then that will let us know who's in cohort 4, right? Process of elimination. And then the other thing is EUT is a very unique situation in Maine, and because of the funding is also unique, and the superintendent is the commissioner. There's lots of different things that we need to ensure, or conversations that are had, so that we can support that.
Okay, just want to make sure that we're part of the conversation as, for our local area. As you know, Piscataquis County is leading the way in being cohort adopters. We're almost all at a cohort, so go figure. Okay, well, thank you, Sandy.
You're welcome. Any other questions today? If not, we thank everybody for coming. Oh, I was sharing that we're meeting again next week because the following week is a holiday. And so we've bumped up our second meeting to next week. So that will be on the 19th. And we will see you all then. Thank you.